Welcome, everyone, to the EdGate Powers podcast series. I'm your host, Rich Portelance, and today I'm excited to have Larry Johnson with me. Larry works with EdGate. During the first quarter, that we are talking about a central theme, which is future-ready alignments, redefining curriculum for what comes next. There's a lot of noise in the market right now. AI-powered alignment tools, automated correlations, rapid tagging at scale, yada, yada. We're going to dive into some of those topics. And while the technology is impressive, the bigger question really is, are we improving alignment or just accelerating it? And is it helping the bottom line or is it causing more problems? So we're going to talk about those things and others. I'll let Larry introduce himself. He has a long background and history with EdGate and in education. Just to remind everyone, March 25th is the webinar, and we are going to be talking about future-ready alignments. With us will be Larry, of course. Peter Coe will be joining us, the Senior Director from Student Achievement Partners. Zarek Drozda, Executive Director of Data Science for Everyone. And our probably most frequent guest, Hillary Rinaldi, the Vice President from Whiteboard Advisors. So we have a great panel coming up for this topic. But now, Larry, give us an intro.
Well, I started out teaching science back in the day and did that for 30 years and retired and actually just sort of changed careers. Really, there was no time frame in between there. I didn't get to really retire. I just changed careers with and became a project manager with EdGate, and I've been working with them for 22 years now. And so a lot of my work originated about 10 or 12 years ago when Virginia started to require third-party reviews of vendors' content that could not be from the vendor. Had to be a third-party outsourced vendor, unbiased, sort of speak. And so I tended to land all those projects. So doing
special person to do that, Larry.
Working with standards and publishers' content and helping them with feedback on, yeah, you're meeting this part of the standard, but not that part. You could add this in your lesson, that type of thing.
That's a good setup actually for my first question, which is, what's changed most about the standards in the last 2 or 3 years? What are you seeing as kind of the most prominent shift?
Yeah, good question. So across US in particular, not as much internationally, but across the US standards, states are adding more elements into the standards. So in other words, they're becoming more granular. The standards are specifying specific requirements of students. So as an example, if there's the old standard might be, students will learn the process of interviewing skills. And now those same standards are being expanded to interviewing community members as well as peers. And so, those elements, publishers need to be aware that they need to expand their lessons to be very specific to address these standards, because every state, of course, is a little bit different. They all like to have their own, set of standards. And so publishers end up often having to create state-specific courses.
So that's a great point, Larry, because we all know the implosion of Common Core and the rise of state-level standards, 50 groups, and they're all somewhat unique. There are some threads that go through, but when you look at that, it poses its own problems of 1 to 50 thing. But now, we're talking about this idea of a future-ready alignment. What does that mean to you if you hear that phrase?
Well, they're going to have to address the specificity of the standards, and that's going to be the biggest challenge. And it's pretty hard to meet that specificity without the human element involved.
Yeah.
The AI it's helpful, but it doesn't discern the specific elements in standards all the time. You can't depend on it. So yeah, that's what I see the biggest piece is.
In the work that you do for EdGate, there's this hybrid model. You're using EdGate, which is a tool that has some AI components to it, and it provides a certain level of capability in order to expand what you do from one state to 50 and then find the gaps and then start to hone in, right? But it's a hybrid model. I kind of looking from the outside in. Can you give shed a little light on that, Larry, so people understand, different than what some folks are doing, which is just pure AI and trying to do an alignment. This is a process born from 7 patents and concept-based architecture that I don't think many people really understand.
Yeah. Well, so we are far more human-based than AI. So AI is helpful, and it does have its place, and we do incorporate it where appropriate. But the biggest piece I think that you need to understand is that it is predominantly human-based. So, for example, if you go into a lesson, AI is going to be assimilating the text that it's supplied to analyze what's going on, whereas visually, there may be things that the students are doing or being asked to do that AI might not pick up on. And so we then focus on the concepts that are happening that AI might not get them all. Yeah.
So along that paradigm, Larry, I want to touch a little bit on EdGate as a tool, because I know that pure AI has real limitations. Where do you see the advantage of bringing in a tool like EdGate into the human model, and how does that differentiate what EdGate does today and what it can do going forward?
Well, I think one application would be for publishers. They can use the EdGate tool to run a report against any set of standards they want, and that report tells them which lessons, based on the concepts, which lessons align to which standards in that state or in that subset. They can filter to just Algebra 1 standards, or they could filter to calculus, or they could filter to English 2 in Texas, or whatever they wanted. So it hones in on just the standard set they need to submit to that state. And then it puts them in the ballpark. And so then they can go through, and then they can fine tune aspects as needed for that particular state. But it's a huge, rather than starting from scratch.
So
yeah.
So it gets you to 80%, and then the last 20% has to be that human component, and EdGate seems to do that at scale.
Yeah, and it may even be 100% initially. It depends on the state, because they're all so different. So in any subject, really.
So let's talk about where these alignments break down a little bit. Small, if you're a smaller publisher, put yourself in, because I think there's 3 levels. There's these ed tech startups, and then you have the mid-level publishers, and then you have the behemoths out there. And we probably could argue there's some other layers, but let's just kind of take those 3 blocks. If I'm a smaller ed tech startup and I'm using AI to get into Virginia, what advantage am I going to have, and what are my disadvantages? Where does that break down?
Well, one of the big advantages for Virginia or other states that require third-party reviews for submission would be that then we can help you with that fine-tuning to meet the individual elements of each of Virginia's standards. So, I mean, that's the biggest advantage, I would think.
Okay, and if they're doing it independently, if I'm a small ed tech startup, I say, I don't want to pay for EdGate. I'm just going to go and I'm going to use AI. I'm going to do my alignments and get in the door. Where does that run afoul in your estimation?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's actually what I was speaking to. So they can do that. So what Virginia requires, and other states that do require third-party reviews now for submission, it means that the vendor has to have that report all done.
Yeah.
Here's your standards, Virginia, and these are our lessons that we think meet each standard. That is not submitted to Virginia. That is submitted to a third-party vendor, which could be EdGate. And in that scenario, their content doesn't have to be in our database. We just need access to those lessons. And almost all submissions now are, there is an online access to the vendor's courses. And so we just go into those courses and look at what the students are doing, and then we say yay or nay on, yes, it does meet that standard. Well, no, you have part of it, but you're not meeting this element of the standard. That's the feedback that entity then would get back. And then they have the choice of editing and making it so their individual lessons meet. Most states are pretty competitive. So if you don't meet 100% of their standards, why bother?
Yeah.
Because it's pretty competitive. And so the goal is to meet 100% of that set, whether it's Algebra 1 or, physical science or whatever. Music, art, whatever it is. And then they can make the adjustment and then send it back to us, and then we can review it again. But they need a third-party vendor to sign off on whatever they submit.
And within that spectrum, what are the most common misconceptions that an organization might have about the standards alignment? Is it that there's third-party review necessary, or is there some other nuance there that people just don't really understand? Again, in this world of I do one, I'm not doing all 50 at the same time unless I have some more advanced tool, right? Where are those misconceptions happening?
I think what I see mostly in the reviews that we do for clients is the misperception is, back to that previous interview scenario, is that, well, the lesson is about interviews. Well, yes, it is, but you're not meeting the elements within the standard. So that's the biggest misperception that I see happening among publishers, is they're not paying attention enough to the detail of which that state is requiring.
Well, that could be because it's the heightened complexity of the whole architecture, right? We have this changing paradigm, as you just described. The standards themselves are more complex. The review process is much more scrutinous, and now you have to do it for 50 states. I mean, that's a paradigm shift in itself. And so one of the things I've heard and I like to talk about is alignment as infrastructure. I don't know if you've heard that, but how does that resonate to you? What does that say to you?
Well, let me ask you, what does that mean to you?
Well, that means that it's no longer just an optional exercise, that it has to be a it has to be a core component. If you're an educational publisher, if you don't have an alignment engine and team, you're toast. You can't be successful in today's market. I don't know.
I would agree with that. And what we're seeing more and more is more states are requiring the third party vendor review of what they're submitting before they even accept anything. They're also starting to require Indiana also coming to mind as another one I've done that is requiring a similar review of their courses itself, not individual lessons per se, but of the course itself. They're called high quality curriculum materials, HQCM. It used to be HQIM, which is a rubric.
Okay.
It's a rubric that is structured so that it gives you a rating, a score of a course. Does it meet all these different criteria that students need to be successful in a course? Are there resource materials? Can they connect to someone if they have questions and things like that? So it's more of the structure of the course itself. So publishers now are being scrutinized really more and more by states on two levels. Actually, the platform and structure of the course itself, as well as the lessons within these courses. Yeah.
I could imagine that
Flex. Yeah.
that time dedication to going through that process only to fail would be a huge, issue for a smaller to mid-sized publisher.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And I heard, kind of secondhand, there was a large publisher that lost out on a contract in Texas because they didn't have their I's dotted and the T's crossed, through the alignment process, and that was a multi-million-dollar contract. I can't imagine the pain that they suffered.
Yeah, and Texas is a little bit unique. I know that's not surprising, but the way they structure things is they are quite detailed, and they want things done a certain way, and they adopt typically statewide, not always, but typically they adopt statewide. So that's why it's such a huge contract. Whereas other states, they can adopt statewide. They put them on a statewide list, but it's often more up to the district whether they want, or even sometimes even individual schools, like Jefferson County in Virginia. So it varies, but
yeah. One of the areas where I had a podcast interview with Kevin from the Texas Board of Education last fall. So terrific interview. We were talking about regionalization of mostly CTE stuff, so that if you're in Galveston, you're going to have the opportunity as a student to be regionalized, to learn those local trades, and the same in the Dallas area. And so they're trying to help bring students up to connect with industry. So their CTE standards are getting very specific regarding those local economies, which is kind of interesting. But as you're saying, the academic standards are across the entire state, huge contracts, and then they're doing these regional CTE plays, which correct me if I'm wrong, there's something like 7 CTE standards for every one academic standard, or some crazy number like that, right?
Well, it depends on which state you're in. So CTE is a whole different animal. So Texas has a plethora of CTE standards as well as their academics. But there are states that, especially agricultural states, their CTE standards tend to mirror their economic situation. So if you're if you're more of a farming state, then you're going to have probably a lot more agri-science type CTE standards and courses available than a state that's highly industrial. And the farming state may have very little or not any IT, CTE stuff. So that is very state specific. So you can't, unlike like the academic arena, you can build an Algebra 1 course and you can be pretty comfortable that that's going to probably pretty much apply to all states.
Okay.
And there'll be tweaks per state, but for the most part, it's going to be, but that's not true for CTE.
I was just going to ask about that, because an electrician standard in Arkansas is not an electrician standard in California, right?
I mean, there may be similarities, but it's less likely. Yeah, they're usually very different, and they're tailored to the economic of that state itself. That's a scary animal.
Yeah. So I know, EdGate's done a lot of work with the Journeys Map product on CTE, trying to, make sense and bring about some ability for people to find and to build career paths based on CTE standards, which I think is a fascinating science, but it's a behemoth of a challenge, as you just rightfully pointed out.
Yeah.
So, everybody's talking about AI alignments, and AI in general. It seems to be the buzzword, and rightfully so. There's a lot good there and a lot that can be done. But where is it falling short when it comes to alignment, in your mind?
In my mind, you need to have the alignment be actually effective and make sense. I don't see how. I don't care how good AI or the programs are, you need that human element of evaluation in there. From what I see, I mean, it's helpful, but it also is misleading.
Okay.
There's results. We did a big project for Gates about a year ago, where we compared math standards across 5 different states, and we used AI to help in the comparisons. But there were times when the comparison was just flat out wrong. And I mean, sometimes you kind of just scratch your head, well, how did AI even come up with this? And then times, well, I can see where it would make that connection, but that isn't what was intended. That isn't right. What was meant. And so the misinterpretations. So yeah, I see that as being, with us.
And beyond just the basic correlation or alignment is, I know EdGate focuses on building metadata and other components, and then obviously the building gap analysis and being able to connect once one alignment is done, and with the idea of concepts, it can connect to other states. So it's taking this opportunity and bringing it much further along. From a project management perspective, how does that help, and where do you see the advantages of that kind of process?
Well, that's a great question. It gives me pause, because from a project management point of view, whatever AI comes up with, you have to verify it. So it actually creates more time involvement on your time to check to make sure that is accurate, whatever AI came up with. So yes, it can help put you in the right ballparks, but at the same time, it can also, be a little annoying that misuse of time, so to speak. So
it sounds like there could be some major economic impact if you don't get it right too. Go down a rabbit hole, it sends you in the wrong way, or if it doesn't have the right review and you don't get the contract, there's a lot of risk associated with that process.
Yeah. If you don't have some sort of, QA of AI, yeah, it's a great risk because you're risking not only is the information you're submitting inaccurate, but you're also risking then your own name.
Yeah.
You're putting your own, your publisher or EdGate or whoever, you're putting yourself at risk if you don't do your due diligence with
And
checking it.
do you see within EdGate as kind of the alignment leader to some extent within the space, because you've been doing it for 28 years, I think now, right? It's been a long time.
Yeah. I've been doing it for 22, but yeah, I think total. Yeah, that sounds about right.
What makes EdGate unique in your estimation, having been there for 22 years?
Well, the niche that we do is a niche no one really wants to do. And so that makes us unique in the fact that we do it. The the it's also our database. Because of what we do, we have just an enormous database. I don't know how many now, 6 million standards, or I don't know wherever it's at, but it's huge. And it's always growing because, we have publishers and clients that want, hey, how about the new Singapore standards? Can we get those? So we're always adding international as well as individual, even within the US. They want, you know, special standards that are not part of the normal academic arena, but they may want standards that are kind of outliers, not in the regular scheme of things, and so it's just always expanding, but nobody has that database of everything. Yeah. So that makes us pretty unique.
So you have this database of millions of standards. And you have the human oversight and with the knowledge base to be able to apply and do the alignments and the correlations at scale. How does the EdGate tech come into play in your job, and where do you see that going over the next 3 or 4 years?
Well, we have we have an amazing tech person who just not only is great to work with, but he has good foresight and good vision of where things are and where they need to be. And so I see it constantly evolving. And where he builds things with help of his team, of course. He builds things so that it makes it easier and more efficient for us to do our job, makes it faster to edit and get clients' content more nestled into where they need it. So I see that as just a constant evolution, like anything, and
he's been there with you, I think, just about the entire time. You guys probably came on about the same time.
Well, actually, he came on before me. He was the original architect, shall we say, for EdGate way back in the day. And yeah, so he, not only does he have the history, but he's got the, investment of all that energy and creative innovation that has been going on for years.
I find it amazing. I mean, you don't see that kind of longevity in many companies. So
No.
Congratulations. And I know Jeremy, his background, and he's not an old guy. He's younger than me, for crying out loud, and he's been there for 26 years. But I look at the innovation, and I'm amazed at what they're doing, and they're in such a thoughtful way. AI is becoming part of a component that's going to enrich what Exact does. I mean, it has to. The speed and the precision, that's there, that can be there. if you don't understand how to harness it, I think you're going to be lost at some point, because humans can only keep up to a certain extent. But
Right.
as you just said, they're making your job easier. They're taking this this patented concept that was there 26, 27 years ago, and this continual evolution with the same group of people for the most part. I mean, where do you see that in society, really? I mean, that doesn't happen too often.
It doesn't, and yeah, I'm outliving all of my clients. I get build up a rapport with somebody, and 3 or 4 years later they're gone, and then I start over with somebody new. And so yeah, you don't see it. It is unusual. And I do want to just kind of comment for the viewers, just so they know, you mentioned earlier that we have this huge database of standards, but it's more than that. It's not just a database of standards, it's a database of standards in which every one of those standards has a concept or concepts attached to it. So it's not just uploading standards into a database. It much bigger process. Human eyes are on every single standard, and our taxonomy is placed on every individual standard. And when you think of 6 million standards, that's a lot of effort over time. And so and then to keep up with it, and because states, probably 30% of the standards in the US alone change year to year. And so they're always updating, and then publishers are scrambling to meet the new standards. We're scrambling to get them in the database for them early. And it's just, yeah, it's quite a dance. And the other piece that I'd like to point out is that we build the exact tool we don't build it in isolation, meaning EdGate doesn't come up with, hey, this would be good, let's do this. We also incorporate input from clients, what they need, and we can build them custom reports if that's what they need. So it's really, I look at it more as it's a collaboration.
Yeah.
We're all on the same team, working to get what you need, and as simple as that.
I really appreciate that description and that correction, because it's funny. Back when I was doing some of the marketing content for EdGate, now I'm just doing this role. I actually wrote the phrase augmented. These are augmented standards. There's nothing that goes in there that's just dumped in there. They're augmented with the metadata and the concepts. I mean, it's enriched in such a way that it makes them useful. And I actually think the number, because back a couple of years ago, Jeremy had said to me, I think, Rich, there's about 7 million in there, but probably 5 or 5.5 are current, because some expire at a certain time. So I would guess that we're getting close to 10 million in there, with 7 or so that are current standards, because I know they just added a whole bunch of international and new CTE standards, and it's just like every week more and more are added, right?
Yeah. And clients, they end up getting clients for themselves that need a certain subset of standards. And like I had a client a few years ago, for example, that wanted to enter the European market, and they needed the common European frameworks for the core subjects. And so we went and found them, downloaded them, attached our taxonomy, put them in the database, and then they could run their reports against those standards, run their content, against those standards, and then they could use that as a tool to show how their content does support the standards in those countries in Europe. So yeah, it's never ending.
And when you're using the exact system, even if you say, I just need to do this one state, you're really gaining benefit of all the other work that has been done by these other companies in some way, shape, or form through that standards database that's attached to the exact system and the analysis that has been done through it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think if I'm understanding you correctly. So for example, they start out just wanting one state, but then, a year down the road, hey, can we add these states too? Sure.
Yeah, because it's
And
already
then,
there in the system.
yeah, or, if you're in language arts and they're in a different arena from just the language arts and they want to get into the ELPs, the English language proficiency standards, which are more for the English language learners, they might want the WITA, the national set of WITA standards. And yeah, those are in our database too, because somewhere in the past, clients asked for that set of standards. So we have them, and then we keep them updated as they update and so on. So yeah, it's a huge advantage. Yeah.
So I want to remind everybody, March 25th is the webinar. There is a link down below in the description. So please sign up for the webinar. Larry will be there along with the other guests, and we're going to be talking about some of these topics. And Larry, this has been a great conversation. I want to switch it just a little bit, and I want to ask you about managing complex multi-state, multi-framework alignment projects. What separates a scalable system from one-off projects?
One project for us could be a multi-state correlation. So that would be one project. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yes, and you've managed those. That's more of a complex project, right? Because it has multi-states. You have to do those alignments. You have to make sure everything works. What separates that from, scalable systems from one-off projects? Just if that aren't multi-state. So how do they differentiate themselves?
So, in the past, publishers would be able to take it on themselves, and they would be able to correlate to a state, which means they don't have a database and they don't have a taxonomy. So they're individually doing their lessons to that, populating it to that standard. And they're building or creating their report as they go, which is very time consuming. And then they go to another state and they start all over, because it's a different state, different set of standards. In our system, they do it once for their content, and then when they run it through the exact system to run a report, they can select whatever states they want, and the taxonomy makes the match between this lesson has this taxonomy term, and that standard does too in Virginia and California and Texas, and so that lesson goes to all those states. So that all happens with, I shouldn't say automated, but that happens automatically when they run the report. The database does all that filtering for them.
And then then your eyes are on it to make sure everything's correct.
Yeah, and then you look at each one, or the vendor looks at each one, whichever, whatever the project requires.
So if you had to do that all by hand, give me an example of the time savings. I mean, is it 80% of the time, 50% of the time?
To do it by hand the first time, maybe a kind of a wash the first time.
Okay.
But then, so let's just, for the sake, let's say it takes you 4 hours, for the sake of just a number. So let's say it takes you 4 hours to align your one course, the lessons in your one course, to Virginia standards. And then, but you also want it to West Virginia. Well, now you're going to do another 4 hours again. But in the exact tool, you just include Virginia and West Virginia and run a report, and you've got them both right there. So it's the initial investment of time, whether we're doing the correlations and loading it into the database, or whether the client is doing it for the first time to one state, that may be kind of a wash, maybe. I mean, we've been doing it for so long, it may be a little faster, but clients they have specialized teams that know their content. So let's just say it works out to be kind of a wash time-wise. But then it's every state after that is where it pays dividends, because that's why they don't do nationwide courses, because it's just impossible for them to do that. It's just too much time and effort and resources, a lot of people involved to do that. If you have 10 math courses and you're going to do those 10 math courses, you're talking 13 grades, K-12, and each grade you've got to, I mean, it's crazy.
That's crazy.
So that's where our niche has been so successful, is it just
so
really helps companies out time-wise.
Exponential time savings,
yeah. So one person can run 20 reports in a day and have what they need, whereas it may take them 2 months.
That brings back the phrase alignment as infrastructure. So that, to me, that's a perfect example of exactly what we were talking about. Is, okay, well, I can have all these people, I can keep doing the same thing, I can keep spending the 4 hours, but that going to add onto a timeline that's infinite. And then if I say I can do it once, and then I can cut even 3.5 hours out of that each other one, now I've reduced that time by so that kind of infrastructure saves considerable resource and time to market. So if you're looking at it from a sales perspective, missing deadlines, missing opportunities. So then the other component of that is this third-party review, which I imagine there's some part of it that, EdGate, having been part of that world for a long time, there's some automations that, can apply in order to make that as efficient as possible as well. Is that true? Or is that?
I wouldn't say automation, because the third-party review is a human being. I mean, we are well-oiled, not to be bragging, but just a point of fact. I mean, we are a well-oiled team. We've done it for a long time. I have 3 or 4 individuals that are just absolutely dynamite. They know exactly what's expected. They know exactly what to do. And so, but it's an individual. It's a person going through, looking at the lesson, seeing what the students are doing. Yep, that meets that standard. No, you got most of it, but this part's missing. So it's relaying that information back to the client. And that is not AI generated. That's human generated.
That's human generated.
Yeah.
And that's required by now. How many states or so do you have an estimate?
Well, yeah, I know Indiana requires it, Virginia requires it, Texas requires it, because those are the ones I see mostly from my clients that they're submitting to those states. So those are the ones I see a lot. But I'm sure there are others. And over time, there's going to be more and more. I think Nevada is another one that comes to mind recently. So, yeah, but it just makes sense. States got burned years ago by vendors just saying they wanted to sell their product. So, yeah, we meet all your standards. Well, then they get feedback from teachers. Well, no.
It doesn't work.
I say that, but no, it doesn't. And so that's, I think, one of the big charges for states to require a third-party review is they wanted an unbiased look at it from somebody that knew what they were doing. They wanted to see that. But walk your talk, walk your talk. So anyway.
We're getting close to the top of the hour. I have a couple more questions. One, I want to pick your brain about the future, Larry? Because you've done this for a long time. You've seen the trends. What do you believe will define alignment work over the next 3 to 5 years?
The next 3 to 5 years, I see it pretty much continuing in the evolutionary vein that it's in that continuing to pay more attention to detail in the standards, because the standards are going to contain more detail. And so publishers need to be aware to build that into their content. And one of the things I hear is, well, it's kind of implied that if the students are going to be doing this, then they'll do that. No, there can't be an implication. No, you got to direct the students to do what the standard is asking them to do. You can't make assumptions that, well, yeah, if they do that, they'll probably do that. No. And so that's the biggest thing, is for people to really pay attention to detail and don't make assumptions on what might happen. Be directive.
Okay.
In your lessons, be directive, actually telling the students what to do, or whatever it is that they want for the results for that particular standard. Yeah.
And if you had to pick one capacity every future ready curriculum organization must build this year or the next, let's say, 18 months, what is it? What should they have on board or coming on board to stay abreast of the changes in the market?
Well, they have to somehow present to the state they're submitting in. They have to somehow submit a report that shows the state standards and how their content aligns, and that has to be verified by not them. Has to be an outside third-party review. And some states are pretty picky. They don't allow anybody. So we're on EdGate is on a vendor list to do that. And I don't know, other states are more, maybe a little bit more relaxed about, as long as it's somebody with teaching credentials, that's okay. I see that evolving to be more specific and more adhered to. I see that evolving.
It's interesting because that's on the legislative side of this, this adoption is, hey, we want to do it this way, and it's got to be reviewed because of what the example you pointed out, where, content wasn't getting the lessons to, the point where they needed to be. They weren't fully meeting the criteria that the standards had set out. So now legislation steps in and they've made it more complex. I'm not saying that's a bad thing necessarily, but it's more complex, period. Do you see additional complexity? Is complexity going to stay steady, or is it going to increase?
I think it's going to increase in general, and the increase is largely due to the complexity of standards, adding those extra elements. Some people refer to them like the action verbs. They're just the elements of the standard that's calling the student to do specific things, like interview community members, not just your peers, that type those elements that are specific. And I see the standards increasing. We see the same thing in CTE standards. They are also becoming more specific. So that is a general trend. And in Australia, for example, the Australian standards, Western Australia, increased in their science. They had a whole brand new section of standards that was specific to scuba diving and snorkeling and all of that, because that's such a large economic piece for Western Australia, for the coast, like at Perth and so on. So, the evolution of it being more granular, more specific, and that in itself adds complexity. And I see publishers, they're going to have a people that are their quality control. They cannot, the idea of simplicity of, oh, AI can do it. Well, yeah, I can do some things, but not a finished product.
Yeah.
So I see that, people have got to embrace that fact. That I don't see any way around it. Whether it's the humans at EdGate doing, their job with it, or people at each of the individual publishers, they've got to have human eyes on projects to make sure it's what it is.
A question I didn't ask is, you talked about how EdGate is using the exact tool to do one-to-many and to reduce timeframes. Is that available to publishers to also license? Is that technology available?
Oh yeah.
So
well, I don't know about elsewhere, but yeah, they can license that tool from us. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's another infrastructure change that, if I'm a CEO and I'm saying I have to look at my costs, all this, increase in the COGS, the cost of goods sold, which would be, these legislative requirements that I have to take on. I want to make sure I'm saving some money someplace. And if I can cut back tremendous amount of hours trying to get into 40 states with this one lesson plan, and I can automate it and save, 90% of the time, that seems like to me a pretty easy decision.
Yeah. Kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
and that works because of our database. The exact tool draws from the database, not only the standards, but all the content. So yeah, and nobody has that database, so I don't know where else they would turn.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I don't know that exists anywhere else.
Well, I'm sure there's other people out there, but we won't mention them on this podcast.
There's none that I know of. There are entities out there that do things by hand.
Yeah.
That do a state by state by hand, but because nobody's, put together the database that we have. It's huge.
It's a differentiator, huh?
Yeah, it is. It's huge. Yeah.
Well, Larry, I want to thank you for being here today. Thank you, everybody who's watched and listened to the podcast. This has been fascinating and really enlightening. March 25th, Larry is going to be back. We're going to be talking about some of these topics with our other panelists. We're excited. Thank you, Larry, for joining. Any final word that you want to say to the audience before we close it out?
No, I think we pretty well covered, other than go Seahawks.
Go Seahawks. All right. I love it. All right, Larry, you have a good day, and thank you everyone for joining.